That snowy night he opened the door and saw a girl with bound hands lying beside a horse, a fugitive, a man who had buried his past, and a cold house about to catch fire again. The winter wind swept along the slopes of Wyoming like icy hands lashing the earth. The snow didn't fall. It dumped in thick white sheets like flour, hammering the rusted tin roof of the lonely wooden house in the barren valley. A night when good folks stayed home and criminals were either dead or hiding deep in liquor and fear. Ben Crowley sat before the fireplace, pulling off his mud-caked leather boots. The wooden chair creaked beneath his back, the only sound besides the fire. He counted each crackle of the burning logs like counting time. His calloused hands rubbed at a throbbing knee, the leftover pain from a horsefall 20 years back, the kind no doctor could fix. Only time and silence. Outside, the wind howled through the fence like a starving beast. The horses in the stable stirred, uneased. Ben caught the sound of iron hooves scraping dirt, rapid breathing. Then something else. Not an animal. It was a sound a man living alone knew by heart. A knock at the gate. 3 slow, uneven raps. Not firm enough for a friend. Not brazen enough for a thief. A hesitant sound, as if it wasn't sure it should exist at all. Ben didn't turn on the light. He shrugged on his coat, grabbed the kerosene lantern and the double-barrel shotgun hanging by the door. Old habits die hard, even after 20 years of peace. The door creaked open, wind flinging snow onto the porch like knives. He circled around the yard, lantern swinging, its yellow glow casting thin strokes over thick snow. The gate wasn't locked, but ajar. Something, or someone, leaned against the fence. It was a horse, trembling, its mane tangled in fear. The reins were torn, the saddle slipping loose, and at its feet, beside a rotting wooden post, was a small figure curled up, hands tied behind her back with rough rope. Ben lowered the lantern. The girl didn't move. Her dress was soaked through, the hem torn, exposing scraped knees. Her hair was clumped with ice and snow plastered to her cheek. Her face was too thin to tell her real age, but he guessed she wasn't yet 16. No one gets lost like this. No one is left in the snow unless someone meant for it to happen. Ben knelt, his knee digging into the freezing snow. He reached out and gently touched her shoulder. Her body was limp, but still warm. She didn't speak, didn't open her eyes, only let out a low moan, faint as wind brushing dead grass. The rope had dug deep into her wrists, swollen and purple. He took out the folding knife from his pocket, the blade glinting under the lantern light. He cut the rope. Slowly, carefully, so it wouldn't hurt more than it already had. When the rope dropped, she shuddered like struck by lightning. Her eyes flew open, pupils wide in the dark, panicked like a cornered fawn. Ben said nothing. He stepped back, sat down in the snow, and placed the lantern by his boots. The girl stared at him, her whole body tense like she might scream, but she didn't. Only panted, eyes locked on his hand, the one holding the now folded knife. They stayed there, wordless, inside the storm. It wasn't until the horse behind her neighed loud that Ella, the name he'd learn later, blinked and looked around. Her lips cracked, nearly bloodless, but her eyes still clung to consciousness. Someone who'd been abandoned too many times didn't trust easily. Ben knew that better than most. He stood, slowly raised his empty hand, then turned his back, walking toward the distant cabin, its windows glowing warm in the blizzard. She didn't follow, but she didn't run either. And so it was, on the first night of snow, the lonely man opened his door, not out of pity, but because something in that girl wouldn't let him walk away. Not duty, not morality, but memory. The wooden door closed behind him, and the storm was locked out on the porch, like a wolf that couldn't find its way into the pen. Ella stood motionless at the threshold, soaked through, hair stuck to her face, legs trembling as if they might give out. Water dripped from her clothes in small trails across the wooden floor, cold and quiet, yet it was the first time she felt she was truly inside a place with a roof. Ben didn't ask her name, didn't ask questions. He placed the knife on the table, then tossed more firewood into the stove. The flames flared up briefly, casting orange-red light across the weathered cheekbones of the mountain man. Then he opened a cabinet and pulled out an old coarse wool blanket, laying it across the chair beside the fireplace. He didn't hand it to her, just left it there and walked into the kitchen like there was some invisible guest in the room. Ella still hadn't moved. Her legs were frozen, maybe from the cold, maybe from unfamiliarity. But something from the cast-iron pot in the kitchen corner stirred her eyes. A smell rich and savory with pepper, onion, and something else. Something only the starving could recognize before words. Ben lifted the lid and stirred the pot. Bone broth stew, simmered since the afternoon. He'd made it to last a few days. He hadn't needed to cook for anyone else. Now maybe he would. He ladled the soup into an old enamel bowl and set it on the table. No silver spoon, just a worn wooden one, its handle smoothed by years. Ben didn't offer, didn't insist. He placed the bowl at the center of the room, then pulled his chair farther away, closer to the fire. Ella hesitated, her eyes flicking between the bowl of soup and the silver-haired man. She stepped forward slowly, as if measuring out her trust. When her fingers touched the bowl, her hands stayed in a guarded curl, ready to pull back at any moment. She sat on the floor, not the chair. Her back leaned against the wall, bowl resting on her knees, hands trembling as she lifted spoon to lips. Each sip of hot broth sent steam up to her face, her eyes closing halfway. It wasn't good soup, but it was the only thing she'd swallowed without fear in a long while. Ben didn't stare. He turned toward the fireplace, chin resting on his hand, eyes on the flames. The girl didn't know it, but this was the first time in years he had cooked for another soul. No one spoke. There was only the soft clink of the spoon against the bowl, and the steady whisper of the fire, like voices from another world. She ate slowly, not ravenous, not frantic with hunger. She ate like she was afraid it would be gone, and once it was gone, there'd be nothing left. When the bowl was nearly empty, Ella stopped. She set it down on the floor, pulled the blanket over her shoulders, and curled into herself, like a small cat. No requests, no demands. Ben rose, fetched a pillow, and placed it gently on the bench near the fire. He didn't say, "Lie down," just placed it there and walked away. When he climbed the stairs, lantern in hand, his steps slow and heavy, the girl had already closed her eyes, long lashes casting shadows over dark hollows beneath. Her lips pressed tight, but her hands still held the empty bowl, as if it were the only proof anyone had ever given her something without taking something back. Upstairs, Ben lay down on the thin mattress, spread across the wooden floorboards. His back ached. The night was cold, but something kept him from sleep. It took a while before he realized what it was. He could no longer hear only his own breath, because down below there was another breath, small, fragile, but real, and for the first time in many years, the old cabin had someone inside again. Dawn was near. Outside, the snow was falling slower now, blanketing the ground like a silent quilt. The wind had shifted, brushing softly against the loose planks of the old horse stable, making them creak like whispers from a long, sleeping memory. Inside the house, the fire in the stove had settled down, glowing dim and steady, like the quiet heartbeat of an old man. Ben Crowley hadn't slept. He still lay on the small loft above, one arm under his head, eyes wide open, staring into the blurry shadows on the ceiling. Downstairs, Ella was asleep. The bench had been pulled close to the stove, but the coarse old wool blanket wasn't enough to cover her long legs, curled up against the cold. One foot stuck out dirty, cracked, and scratched with wounds that hadn't yet crusted over. Her left hand still clutched the pillow, not to sleep on, but as a kind of defense, a habit of survival. Ben stepped quietly down the wooden stairs, each footfall made as light as he could manage. He paused in the center of the room, eyes resting on the dim, flickering glow of the kerosene lantern. Then his gaze shifted to the girl, sleeping softly, her pale cheek lit faintly by the orange firelight. It had been a long time since this house held the breath of someone other than him, and a long time since the fire had burned for two. He didn't know how to name the feeling, only that on a night this cold he no longer felt like the last soul left alive on the edge of the wild mountains. He was no longer just the old man, gruff, silent, living beside horses like a tired old wolf who'd stopped chasing anything. Ben added more wood to the stove, gently, like tending a flame that was more than just wood and ash, but also human. He pulled the blanket further over the girl's legs, then drew his hand back quickly, as if afraid the gesture said too much. He turned away and sat down in his usual wooden chair by the window. Outside, the snow drifted like pale ash. The sky was gray, still like a confession left unfinished. Maybe the girl would leave tomorrow. Maybe she was nothing more than a single cut across the long, flat stretch of years that had dragged on too long. But in this moment, right now, something had changed. Not that his life had gotten better, but it wasn't empty anymore. And for a man like Ben, that alone was enough to keep him awake through the whole night without a single regret. Morning came, and no one said hello. Ben opened the stable door like he always did, stepping out in his old, worn, heavy coat. The ground was pure white, snow packed tight beneath his boots, letting out soft, hissing sounds like the short breath of a mountain morning. Ella had been up for some time. She was busy mucking out the horse stall, wielding an iron shovel nearly half her size. No one had told her to. No deals had been made. She did it as if she'd done it before, or maybe just needed to keep her hands moving so her mind wouldn't. The horse from last night, the black one named Shadow, stood in the corner of the stall. Its eyes were still wild, but its body had relaxed some. Ella stroked its mane, whispering something to it. Ben watched from a distance. He didn't step in, didn't interrupt. Two people, one old, one young, each in their own quiet space, yet both living on the same patch of snow. Every step, every act carried its own rhythm, slow, wordless, but not unfamiliar. Ben was sharpening the old kitchen knife inside. Steel against stone, steady scraping sounds, echoing through the cabin like a clock counting time without numbers. He sat by the window, gray light seeping through glass fogged with breath. He kept sharpening, like grinding down the questions in his mind he didn't yet know how to ask. Ella came inside around noon, slipping off her wool gloves, one torn at the thumb. No one asked who'd eaten. Ben set a plate of cold bread on the table, poured coffee into a cream-colored enamel mug. Ella didn't thank him. She just sat, ate in silence. She didn't drink the coffee, just held it in both hands for warmth. That afternoon, Ella pulled a few broken boards back into place on the chicken yard fence. Ben gathered the hay that had blown loose behind the stable. Now and then, their eyes met, not for long, not urgently, like two people living near the edge of a cliff. Just enough to know the other was still there, then turning back to what needed doing. Before sunset, Ben quietly hung the kerosene lantern back on its hook by the porch. Ella stood by the fence, looking toward the base of the hill, where the hoofprints from yesterday had already faded beneath the snow. No one spoke all day, but everything had been said. in glances, in presence, in the steady drip of melting snow from the roof into a rusted metal pail. Plink, 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 a slow rhythm, like the fragile heartbeat of a soul still learning to trust again. The morning started late. Faint sunlight filtered through the snow-covered window, leaving pale streaks of light across the old rug. Ben came down from the loft, his legs stiff from the night's cold. He wasn't used to sleeping with someone else beneath him. But this morning he'd heard the clinking of metal from the stable, through the crack beneath the door. A steady rhythm, light but certain, like someone was already at work. Ella was wringing out a shirt at the doorway when he stepped outside. The wool flannel had nearly dried, with just a few damp patches clinging to the back. The sunlight touched the rolled-up sleeves, revealing her slender wrist and the scar. It wasn't fresh, but it was clear. Long, thick, raised against her pale skin, the mark of a rope pulled too tight, or a hand that once acted like a whip. Ben didn't ask, but his gaze lingered a moment longer than usual. Ella noticed. She quickly tugged the sleeve down, gripped it tight, and turned away. He said nothing, just walked over to the wooden cupboard in the corner, rummaged for a moment. When he returned, he placed something in her hand. An old wool scarf, frayed at the edges, ash gray, knitted in an old pattern, carrying the faint scent of pine wood and stove smoke. Ella hesitated. She didn't take it right away. She looked at him, then at the scarf, as if it were something too precious to touch. But Ben didn't meet her gaze. He stepped out onto the porch, down the steps, and pulled the shovel off its hook. It wasn't about warmth. He gave her the scarf because he couldn't bear to see that scar again. Not out of pity, not out of fear, but because it reminded him of something he hadn't let himself feel in too long. The helplessness of watching someone hurt and knowing you couldn't stop it. Ella wrapped the scarf around her neck, gently, as if afraid it might tear. The old wool smell pulled her somewhere far off, maybe to a warm bed in childhood, or someone's sleeves wrapped around her once, long ago. She stood there for a long time, doing nothing, not looking outside. That whole day she didn't go to the stable. She stayed indoors, wiping out the cabinets, dusting near the hearth, folding old blankets. Little things, but the kind only someone living in a house notices. That afternoon, when Ben returned from a short trip up the hill to check the fence, he found Ella sitting on the long wooden bench by the window. She was still wearing the scarf, and for the first time, she didn't brace herself when he walked into the room. The scar on her wrist hadn't disappeared, but now it was hidden by something more than just a sleeve. It was covered by a gesture, small as it was, but just enough to make someone start believing they weren't seen as a wound anymore. Snowfall came light the next morning, soft flakes gathering on the stable roof, sliding down like whispers that never found their voice. Ben rose earlier than usual. He was used to mornings without greetings, without sound, so when he came down and didn't see Ella, he didn't hurry. But then his eyes paused at the wooden table by the fireplace. A small piece of paper, not the kind he used for jotting down fence repairs or feed notes, lay neatly beneath a chipped enamel cup. Pale yellow paper, edges folded crisply, handwriting firm and steady, with no tremble in the lines. The letters were dark, straight, each stroke cut into the page like claws into wood. I'm not a thief. I didn't kill anyone, but someone wants me dead. No name, no apology, no promise, just 3 sentences, but inside them lived a whole life on the run, a sentence never tried in court, and a wound no longer pretending to be hidden. Ben stood still for a long time. He didn't sit, didn't pick up the paper to read it again. He just stood, as if his legs didn't know where to carry him now that they knew this. At last he folded the note slowly and tucked it into the inside pocket of his coat, the place where he used to keep his wife's letters and maps he no longer needed. Outside, the familiar clinking of metal echoed again. Ella was feeding the horses. She hadn't run in the night, hadn't vanished into the woods like others he'd seen over the years. Ben didn't go out right away. He sat down, poured himself a bit of black coffee into a cracked porcelain mug. The bitter heat rose slowly, an old habit that helped him think more clearly. He thought about the 3 sentences, not because of what they said, but because she'd written them. No plea for sympathy, no rambling tale, just a burden placed down, light as a small stone, yet heavy enough that if it remained on the chest, it might kill someone in silence. Ella came back in near noon, carrying a bundle of firewood on her shoulder. Her coat was streaked with mud, the scarf crooked, but her hands were steady as she stacked the wood in the corner. She didn't ask if he'd read the note, didn't act like she'd left anything behind at all. Ben didn't speak. He just nodded as she passed by, a small gesture, but for the first time between them, there was something close to acceptance. Not forgiveness, for no one had done wrong, not trust, not yet, but a quiet agreement. If she didn't leave, he wouldn't ask. And the note now lay silent in his coat pocket, not as a question to be answered, but as a reminder that sometimes the thing a person needs most is simply for someone to believe they're not beyond saving. That night the world was as still as a dry well. No wind howled, no snow fell. Only the cold slipped through the cracks in the wooden planks, like fingers stirring the surface of old memories. Ben sat alone by the fireplace. The flames had quieted but still breathed with the steady rhythm of a stubborn heart. In his hand was an old silver coin, worn smooth, its face long faded, a trinket with no value to anyone else, but one he'd never let go. It was the thing he carried whenever a hard decision needed making, not for spending, but for tossing into the fire. His own way of telling himself, when the coin hits the flame, hesitation burns with it. Ella was asleep in the corner of the room, curled under a threadbare blanket, head resting on the extra coat he'd given her. Her breath was light, like the whisper of snowy pines settling under nightfall. She didn't know, but her quiet presence had stirred something in Ben, reminded him that once, long ago, he'd had a daughter, and that he'd lost something he could never quite get back. Ben turned the coin in his fingers, his thumb tracing its smoothed edge. He thought again of the 3 sentences on that note. Not a cry for help, not a plea for forgiveness, just a truth, simple enough that it couldn't be ignored. I'm not a thief. I didn't kill anyone, but someone wants me dead. Part of him wanted to let her go. Clean, simple, no mess. But the other part, the part of the man who'd lived more than half a life in silence and regret, couldn't look away from those eyes, the eyes of someone who knew no one believed her, but still went searching for one last place to hide. Ben sighed, the kind of sigh that seemed to peel another year off his bones. He lifted the coin up, letting it catch the flicker of fire one last time. Then he let it go. The sound of metal hitting coals was small, sharp, but it rang like a sob caught in the throat. The fire rose, its light flaring briefly in his eyes. Ben didn't move, just watched the flames, like he was staring at a version of himself from far away. Tomorrow he'd say something. Not much. He'd never been one for words. Maybe just, if you want to stay a few more days, I won't ask questions. But tonight, everything stayed quiet, and in that silence the silver coin sank into the embers, like a promise that didn't need to be spoken aloud. Outside, the snow had begun to melt, revealing patches of reddish-brown earth gathered along the fence line. The air wasn't warmer, but the sunlight piercing through the gray clouds was just strong enough to catch the thin trails of smoke rising from the kitchen chimney. Ella stood beside the horse trough, brushing Shadow's mane, the black horse that had once carried her away from the dark. Her hands were still clumsy, the old wooden comb groaning as it passed through the knots and tangles. But she was patient, not because she knew what she was doing, but because she needed something to slow her heartbeat down. Ben watched from a distance, a bucket in one hand, not stepping in. He was used to living without stepping into other people's lives, even when someone happened to cross into his. As Ella bent down to untangle the reins, something slipped from her coat pocket. A faint clink of metal on dirt, small enough that only a man trained to notice the sound of a gun would care. Ben walked closer. It was a silver necklace broken in two. One half still had the chain, the other was a warped circular pendant. Etched into it, shallow and rough, was the outline of a flower, handmade, clumsy, like something carved by an untrained hand. Or maybe a child. Ben stooped to pick it up. His hand froze the instant his eyes caught the carving. Just a second, but it was enough, because he had carved that flower many years ago onto a necklace just like this one, for his wife. Ben looked over at Ella. She had straightened up, her face unreadable, but her grip on the reins had tightened. She saw him pick up the pendant and she didn't ask for it back, didn't explain. Ben opened his palm, eyes on the fragment. That flower. He had carved it long ago for the woman he once loved, a southern girl sold west to marry a ranch owner. They had loved each other quietly, like two trees growing close enough to share sunlight and water, but not words, until the day she vanished without goodbye, leaving only the necklace on the windowsill. Ben had thought she was dead, or maybe she'd left, afraid that the dry, brutal West would crush whatever softness she had left inside. But now the pendant was here, in the hands of this girl, like a nod from the past, gentle, but certain. Ella kept her head down, didn't speak, didn't look, as if she too didn't understand why the old man stood so still, as if he were touching a ghost. Ben closed his hand and slipped the broken necklace into his coat pocket. He didn't ask, didn't press. It wasn't time. But now he knew. The girl wasn't as much a stranger as he had thought, and some threads don't break, even when time snaps them in two. Winter in Wyoming doesn't end by the calendar. There are days when the sky clears, the wind stills, and birds call from the hillsides, as if spring were quietly catching its breath. But then suddenly the cold returns without warning, dragging behind it a thin veil of mist, like a burial shroud laid gently over the barren fields. That morning Ben went to the creek. He often went there when he needed to think, or needed not to think at all. The little stream never froze solid thanks to an underground spring running deep beneath the earth. It was the only thing in his life that still moved with steady purpose. As he bent down to draw water, he saw the sign. Hoofprints. Not shadows, and not from the old mule he'd used for hauling wood last season. These were bigger, heavier, and fresh. Ben didn't crouch down like a tracker. He didn't have to. Life in this land had taught him, when the earth tells a story, all you have to do is listen. The horse hadn't come alone. 4 prints, even, unbroken, no sign of turning back, which meant someone was coming, not leaving. Ben stood, turned, and looked toward the ridge. No one, but he knew people don't wait to be seen before they start existing. That evening, he didn't make soup, just boiled water and poured it into the thermos, like he needed to keep his hands busy so his mind wouldn't drift too far into what he already knew. Ella helped split kindling. She didn't ask questions, but her eyes had changed. She wasn't stealing glances anymore. She looked straight at him now, like she was measuring how he'd react to the thing she, too, could sense. Danger was coming. Ben went down into the cellar behind the horse stall, a place he hadn't stepped into in nearly 20 years. He had to bring the lantern. The smell of damp, moss, and rusted metal rushed up and made him cough. Behind a hastily nailed board was the shotgun, wrapped in canvas, old, but still remembering how to speak. When he returned to the house, Ella was sitting on the doorstep, arms around her knees, eyes watching the path that cut across the hills. Ben set the shotgun on the table. Didn't say anything, didn't try to hide it. Ella saw it. She didn't look surprised. She simply stood, walked silently to the stable. One hand reached for Shadow's reins, the other clenched, like it had found the one thing it could still trust. On the ridge, the wind began to howl again, as if something or someone was slowly crossing the last safe boundary between two people and the past. He came on a cloudless noon. The sky was pale blue, like the face of a man burning with fever. Silent in a way that made you uneasy, his black horse moved at a steady pace, not hurried, but each hoofstep kicked up dust, dry and red like blood baked into the earth. Ella was behind the stable. Ben stood on the porch, still holding the cloth he'd been using to wipe the axe blade, but his eyes didn't blink. Rufus Denton wore no uniform. He didn't need to. A tall man, broad-shouldered, with a face chiseled like sandstone. He carried the silence of those who'd walked through too many dead places. His eyes were ash gray, not looking at a person, but through them. When the horse stopped, he didn't dismount right away. He slowly pulled off his gloves, revealing hands paler than his face. The hands of a man used to giving orders, not touching dirt. "Been a while, Crowley." Rufus spoke in a voice low and rough, like wind scraping down a chimney. It wasn't a greeting. It was a statement made to be heard. Ben didn't answer. He set the cloth down, his eyes still on the horse, its flanks steaming, mane damp with sweat. It had come far and fast. "I'm here for a girl, a child who doesn't know her place." Rufus stepped off the horse. His boot struck the wooden step with a snap like a dry twig breaking. "There's no one here," Ben said, his voice calm, rough, not raised. Rufus gave a short laugh, one that never reached his eyes. "Oh, there is, and you know it. I didn't bring the law, Crowley. I don't need to. All I have to do is say a few names. Names you buried alongside your wife." A creak from the back door. Ella stood in the shadows behind Ben. Rufus didn't look at her. He didn't need to. "That girl is property," he said, like tossing down an unpaid bill. "She ran. I'm here to collect what's mine." Ben lifted his hand and rested it on the doorframe. His fingers were stained with axe oil, calloused and cracked, but steady. "No one's property on this land," he said. A cold wind swept through the yard, scattering dry straw across the dirt. Rufus didn't flinch. He took a single step back, turned his horse, and just before riding off, spoke the kind of sentence that couldn't be mistaken. "I'll be back when the snow melts. Then either the girl leaves, or you stay in the ground." It wasn't a threat. It was said like a weather report. When his figure vanished behind the old willow trees, Ella finally stepped past the threshold. Her face didn't change, but her hand gripped her coat so tight, blood welled between her fingers. Ben said nothing. He walked inside, opened the drawer beneath the staircase. There, beneath a pile of old blankets, lay a single bullet. The last one he'd cast with his own hands 20 years ago, not meant for hunting game. That night there was no fire in the house, only the sound of wind battering the doors, and metal touching metal in the dark. The next morning the snow began to melt. Not much, just a few wet streaks across the ground, but enough to know that winter had slipped past its peak. Ben was up before dawn. He pulled on a felt hat, buttoned his wool coat, and headed to the stable without needing to be called. He didn't look at Ella, didn't give instructions, but when he began pulling up rotten boards, sealing gaps with fresh nails, Ella understood. He wasn't planning to leave. There was no talk of escape, just repairs to the stable, just lining the inner walls with more wood, just digging a narrow trench behind the house, leading toward the rear slope. Ben didn't say, "We'll fight." He simply packed bullets into a leather pouch. Ella didn't ask, "When is he coming back?" She just whittled long wooden poles into sharp points, not for fencing, but to plant behind the stable door. Ben's stable faced west, where the wind couldn't strike head-on. The back wall leaned into the foot of the mountain with a slim chute just wide enough for one person. Years ago, Ben had built it to stash bootleg liquor when the militia still roamed. Now it was the way out. The girl hung a bunch of dried peppers up high, not for cooking. It was a signal. If they fell, it meant someone had touched the door. They worked like two craftsmen long familiar with one another. No words, no glances, just the sound of hammering, nails driving into wood like the heartbeat of a horse. Every strike sealed off another piece of the past. And the future, hazy as it was, gained one more layer of protection. Ben tossed firewood into a corner, stacking it like fortifications. He draped straw blankets over the top, to make it look like simple winter prep. Ella cut the reins into lengths and hid them in 3 corners of the stable. So if she had to run, she wouldn't need to search. At noon, Ben buried a tin box beneath the dirt floor. Inside were 2 silver bullets, a faded scrap of paper with a phone number, and a handkerchief stitched with the letter C. It wasn't for the enemy. It was in case he didn't make it. By afternoon, the wind had gone still. Sunlight skimmed across the roof and lit up an old scar on the wooden wall. Ella stared at it for a long time, then reached out to touch it. The scar hadn't healed clean, but it was dry now, like her heart. By nightfall, Ben's stable wasn't a stable anymore. It was a shelter, a stronghold, a last stand for 2 people who had nowhere else to go. And that night, for the first time, Ella spoke first. "If he comes, you don't have to shoot. Let me do it." Ben didn't nod, didn't shake his head. He just placed a hand on her shoulder, a brief touch, heavier than 1,000 words. The sun hadn't fully risen yet when the fog rolled in, thick and gray like a herd of lost sheep, swallowing the road and the breath with it. The horse stable held its breath in that dense, milky silence, as if the world had vanished beyond, leaving only 2 souls waiting. Ben wore his old military coat, the one that had kept him warm crossing the Colorado peaks back in 1869, before anyone called him the quiet old horseman. He slid the final bullet into the chamber, then tucked the revolver into his belt. Ella wasn't wearing anything heavy, just the old wool scarf wrapped around her neck, the one Ben had once given her without a word. Her hair was tied back beneath a cloth cap. Her eyes showed no fear, but no peace either. No one spoke, only breath and the sound of hooves pressing through half-frozen mud on the far edge of the field. Rufus came. Not in a rush, not with a shout. He rode a black horse, wore a dark leather coat, face hard like carved stone. 2 men rode behind him, not many, but enough to break down a fence. He didn't call any names, just stopped at the gate and stared straight at the stable, like he could tear it open with his eyes. Ben stepped forward, stood still, legs rooted in the earth like a tree. His hands didn't touch the gun, just hung by his sides. Rufus knew that stance. He'd seen it once during a gunfight near the border, where a man didn't need to draw first, only shoot once. "Ben Crowley," Rufus said, voice cold as snow melting on steel. "I'm here for the girl." Ben said nothing. "This ain't your business, old man. She's runaway stock. All I need to do is take her back. No one has to die." Ben glanced at the stable. The door was still closed, but there was a sliver of light coming through, and a pair of eyes behind it. Rufus raised his hand. One of the men beside him dismounted and stepped forward. But before he could touch the gate, Ben's revolver was out, fast, clean, automatic. A single shot cracked the air, burying a bullet deep in the ground right beside the man's boot. "One more step, you lose the leg," Ben growled, voice coarse as whetstone. Rufus chuckled, but it wasn't a real laugh. "Good," he said. "I like a little show." He drew his gun, but the first shot didn't come from Ben. It came from the stable. A loud, sharp blast echoed through the fog, sending crows scattering from dead branches. Rufus staggered, hit in the left shoulder, not fatal, but enough to stop him cold. Ella stepped out from behind the door. Her hands shook, but her eyes didn't. The pistol in her grip weighed heavy, but she didn't drop it. She hadn't shot to kill, but she had shot, for the first time in her life. Ben didn't turn to look at her, but he stepped forward, placing himself directly between Rufus and the girl. Like a stone door that wouldn't budge. "Leave," he said. Rufus clenched his jaw, but he knew. He'd lost the edge. Not with a bleeding arm, and not with a girl holding a gun who once thought she wouldn't live to see the morning. He climbed back on his horse, turned around. No promises of revenge, no threats, only anger trailing behind him in the fog. When they were gone, Ella sank to the ground, still holding the gun. Her breath came ragged, not from fear, but because for the first time in her life, she'd managed to protect something. Ben sat beside her. He didn't smile, didn't console. He picked up the revolver, checked the chamber, then set it down between them. "First shot," he said softly, "and your hand didn't shake." Ella didn't answer. She just breathed, slow, deep, and for the first time in years, she no longer felt like something being hunted. The sun rose slow and pale, casting gold across the thick planked walls, and onto the gun now resting quietly in the light. No longer a weapon, but something claimed, something earned. The snow had stopped, but the land remained white with a dull, lifeless pallor. The sunlight was thin, like peeled skin, stretching through the bare-limbed trees. On the ground, footprints and hoofmarks smeared the surface, some already erased by wind, others pressed deep, like memories that refused to fade. Ben walked slowly toward the house. The left shoulder of his coat was stained dark where the blood had dried. It wasn't a heavy wound, but enough to tilt his gait ever so slightly. Ella followed behind. Both hands held the pistol, cocked but no longer cold. She watched his back, thin, hunched, but never once bowed. They stepped onto the wooden porch. The door was already ajar, wind creeping in, carrying the smell of gunpowder and half-burned wood. Ben sat down in the wooden chair by the dining table. He didn't take off his coat, didn't complain. He simply loosened his belt, drew the old pistol, and laid it down on the scarred tabletop. Ella stood still, in the room still heavy with the warmth of the fight. She didn't know what to do, wash her hands, fold the blankets, ask if he was hurt. No, she didn't ask. She simply stepped forward slowly and sat on the edge of the opposite chair. She didn't draw her gun, just looked. Ben didn't look back. He opened the drawer, pulled out a worn roll of bandages. He unbuttoned his coat, revealing a tear in his shoulder, not deep, but ragged. Ella reached forward. He shook his head. "I can do it myself," he said. Not harsh, not cold, just the voice of a man used to doing things alone. She didn't insist. She got up, poured a glass of water, and set it next to the bandages. A small act, without words, like everything between them from the start. Ben wrapped the wound, slow but steady. When he tied the last knot, Ella placed her own gun on the table next to his. 2 guns side by side, one old, one new, one that had killed, one that had just saved. Ben stared at them. After a moment he picked up his own, turned it lightly in his hand, then slid it across the table toward her. No pressure, no explanation. "It's yours now," he said, dry-voiced. "I don't need it anymore." Ella didn't reach for it. She looked at the pistol like it was a chapter of a life, one she didn't want to hold, but couldn't turn away from either. Outside, the wind rose again. Not a storm, just the mountain wind. Dry, cold, always reminding folks there's something out there bigger than themselves. Ben leaned on his knees, stood up, walked to the door. It was still open. He didn't close it, just stared out at the emptying white field. Might be the stable needs fixing again, he muttered, as if just thinking aloud. Wind's starting to slip through the west wall. Ella said nothing, but a few minutes later she left the table, grabbed the hammer, and stepped into the yard. The door stayed open, but no one else crossed it. That morning the sky was clear, silver pale, quiet like a goodbye left unsaid. The wind had pulled back. The snow had stopped. All that remained was the hard ground and the faint, fading tracks of old wagon wheels, pressed into the gravel like stories that never got told. Ella stood beside the smoky gray horse. Its name was Shadow, Ben had said. She wore the gray wool coat he'd left hanging by the door. Didn't ask to borrow it. She didn't need to. It was the only thing he'd left out in the open, unhidden. Ben sat on the steps. Same thick wool clothes, same high boots, sleeves rolled to the elbow. His chin was unshaved, hair uncombed, but he sat straighter than usual, as if something inside him had just been returned. Ella didn't hug him, didn't shake his hand. She simply bowed slightly, taking the small cloth bundle he offered. Inside, the silver necklace, repaired, a scrap of deer-hide map, hand-drawn, and a letter, written in shaky but deliberate ink. Ben didn't read the letter again, didn't meet her eyes. "Marked a few spots on the map," he said, voice rough like stones shifting in the throat. "Watch the road past Red Creek. Rocks tend to fall this time of year." Ella nodded lightly, said nothing. She tucked the bundle into her saddlebag, checked the reins. Her hands didn't tremble, her eyes no longer wary, only calm, the kind that comes when you know your path has changed. Ben stood as she mounted. He didn't wave, just stepped one foot out onto the porch, like a habit he hadn't used in years. Ella swung herself into the saddle. The horse snorted, shifted its shoulders, and started walking, not fast, not looking back, as if it knew this time they weren't running. At the wooden gate, the same one where she'd once been tied up, Ella pulled the reins. She looked around. The scene was the same, but she was not. She turned her head. Ben was still standing there, one hand resting on the porch post. He didn't raise it, didn't wave. Ella nodded, just once, soft, a farewell that didn't need words. Then she pressed her heels. Shadow passed through the gate, over the ridge, across the blood-stained snow long covered by winter, and slowly disappeared into the last breath of the season's fog. Ben didn't go back inside. He stood there, watching the fading white beyond, one hand still on the post, the other grazing the edge of the weathered table. The house was quiet, but this time the silence wasn't empty. It was the absence of a breath that had once brought a whole life back to life. There are wounds that don't need healing, only someone willing to stay. There are homes that don't need repair, only a different breath quietly passing through. Ben never asked the girl's name. She never asked him for anything. But between them, each had returned to the other something they thought long gone, a reason to trust again. And maybe, somewhere beyond the snow-covered hills, where the old fence still bears the marks of that day, they'll meet again, not to explain anything, just to nod, like two people who once shared a winter, a bowl of soup, and a silence worth a lifetime. If you've ever met someone just once, and they left behind a quiet place in your heart that never truly faded, tell the story if you wish, or just leave a small mark. I believe some things don't need to be said to be understood.